First winter we built our cabin.
Okay. Hey, we'll get started pretty close on time. During the pandemic, I started on this notebook. It is nowhere near complete yet. And I welcome anyone's knowledge of any of the men in here, or men whose names have not been added as confirmed captains yet. When I made my first draft, and then read it out loud and timed it, I said, okay, I've got to eliminate an awful lot of stuff, because I had gone into the differences in the various vessels and how far each one tended to go because of its size, and a lot more about the dangers of going to sea and some of the family stories. I still have some of that, but I have tried to keep it around an hour unless I start going off script. But this all started because of wanting to get the names of Stockton sea captains. And like other towns around Penobscot Bay, men often here were involved in either the building of ships or the manning and commanding of ships. Between 1770 and 1920, over 3,000 vessels were built along the bay and up some of the rivers. Maine was in the forefront building ships and supplying the men to run and command them. This includes everything from small sloops right up to good-sized clipper ships. Stockton men could be found as the captains of fishing boats, coastal schooners, larger vessels going to the West Indies, and even on ocean-going vessels sailing to ports all over the world. At least 200, I told you 237, but it's 236 men have been confirmed so far as Stockton captains. Either they lived here all their lives, they grew up in Stockton and possibly lived part of their adult life here, or they grew up elsewhere but moved here after they married a Stockton woman. So that is how I determined that they were a Stockton captain. The men represented 71 different families in town, or what became Stockton. The Berries, Cliffords, Frenches, Griffins, Harrimans, Hitchbans, Partridges, and Staples families all added more than 10 men to the Stockton captains. And some of them added a lot more when you include those family members who were in Prospect, in Searsport, across the river in Alland, but these are Stockton men. There was a definite hierarchy of captains. Any man who owned a vessel of most any size could call himself a captain, just as anyone today who owns a recreational boat can call him or herself a captain. A man rose upwards in the hierarchy as the vessels and crew he commanded grew, and as he sailed further away from home, increasing the knowledge that he had to have in order to sail safely and bring his cargo safely to port. Captains had to be navigators, disciplinarians, diplomats, businessmen, knowledgeable about seamanship, and often a leader of Sunday services. If they went to other countries, they also had to know about the rate of exchange for different types of currency. Sons of captains might become captains in their early 20s because of their experience aboard ship. The cream of the crop were the Cape Horners, the men who went around Cape Horn because that was one of the most dangerous places for ships in the entire world. The strength of the currents, the strength of the winds, the storms there, and in a lot of storms, because it was so far south, when the waves came up over the ship, they could end up with the rigging and the lines all being frozen, which made it very difficult for anyone to work with. It was also one of the places where more men could be easily lost overboard because of all of the roughness. We had one known whaling captain, Captain Henry Harriman. There could have been more, but that's the only one that I have seen specifically listed as a whaling captain. There were some men who went to the islands off the west coast of South America as part of the guano trade, bird and bat poop that was used as fertilizer. The cargoes taken from Maine by the trading vessels varied by their destination. Schooners often traveled up and down the coast taking local products like lumber, hay, apples, vegetables, and fish, salted, dried, canned, or fresh, to market. Cuba and the West Indies were big customers of lumber, timber, and ice. Schooners and brigs commonly were used for the West Indies trade. Other cargoes might be granite, slate, lime, and limestone. Cargo brought back from the West Indies and South America might be wine, copper, tropical fruit, cacao beans, molasses, sugar, or rum. I have not seen any captain from Stockton listed as directly being involved in the slave trade. But that doesn't mean there wasn't one, because that has become something that isn't talked about too much. But any of them who were bringing back rum or molasses or cotton from the southern states, they were indirectly aiding the slave trade and the slavery system, because those were all products that required a lot of slave labor. Stockton vessels took lumber to Australia, furs and ginseng to China, and if they took the Cape Horn route, they might pick up sandalwood from the Pacific Islands to take to the Far East. On the return trip, they might bring back tea, silk, lacquerware, wallpaper, brassware, furniture, rice, porcelain, and even opium when it was legal. The house below me when I was growing up had a mulberry tree, not a bush, but a mulberry tree in the backyard that Captain Staples had brought back from the Far East. And the front parlor was papered in Chinese wallpaper that he'd brought back. Vessels varied by the number of masts, the amount of cargo they could carry, and the number and type of sails and rigging used. Clipper ships were developed for speed. Their narrow hulls dropped cargo capacity, so in order to be profitable, they had to take on expensive cargo or especially perishable cargo. They also tended to have more sails mounted on each mast, which meant their crew had to be bigger. That meant it was more expensive to run the ships. So that was another reason they had to go for the expensive cargoes. Slower vessels with greater capacity, many of them called downeasters, took all the other types of cargo. They didn't have as many sails, they didn't need as big a crew, they went a little more slowly, They got goods to the ports, but they didn't need to have the expensive cargoes. Wives and children of fishing and whaling captains rarely accompanied the captains. The fishing captains usually were not gone for that long. The whaling captains could be gone for several years. But I have an idea it may have to do with the work that was involved in getting the whales from whale to oil to put in the barrels. Those who were in the guano trade also rarely had their families go with them. But the transoceanic voyages of the trading vessels were a different matter. Wives and children often joined the captains aboard ship, living in a good-sized cabin at the stern. They usually dealt only with the cook, the steward, or the mates. The captain's wife might become the ship's nurse, and the sons would be given access to more of the vessel and crew as they got older. Many children were born at sea. Some wives and daughters stayed aboard for many years, seeing much of the world. Often the daughters were sent ashore before their teens to keep them away from the sailors' influence on them and their influence on the sailors. Before then, they may have learned about charts, ship's logs, and a little bit of navigation as part of their schooling on board ship. Many captains' daughters became wives of captains and continued to learn about navigation and seamanship. Sons often continued sailing with their fathers, learning many skills of both the sailors and the officers. These sons were often captains of their own smaller vessels by the time they were 21. Mrs. David Barry, if any of you know Margaret McGrath and her house on Main Street, that was the Captain Barry house. And when her daughters reached their teens, she came ashore with them instead of having them stay with relatives. And she was asked why she didn't stay on board ship with her husband because she enjoyed going to sea. And she said her husband could look after himself, but she didn't think teenage girls should be doing without their mother. Many of the captains who sailed across oceans became master mariners, which was a title they had to earn from their experience and knowledge. In 1863, a criteria both for becoming a master mariner and for designating the quality of the ships was developed by a whole slew of different people who were interested. The insurers, the ship owners, the shipbuilders, the captains. They formed a big association. Part of it was because of the Confederates who were having such an impact on shipping. Seizing ships, sinking ships, taking the cargo from the ships. And the idea was that the better experienced a captain was, and the better condition the ship was in, the better chance they had of evading the Confederate privateers. To become a master mariner, they decided that a man had to be at least 21 and have 6 years of service as a sailor. They had to be in good standing with the ship's owner and had to pass a test of nautical skills and science. The Shipbuilders Association continued to be the main body for about 20 years for establishing those who were licensed as master mariners. And they were licensed for 1 year. They had to renew their license regularly. The criteria for the ships labeled them as ones only for local trade and inexpensive cargo to those who the ships were judged to be fit for any ocean and any cargo. So they had a continuum. If you walk through any cemetery in Stockton or any coastal town, you'll find stones that tell of souls lost at sea, died in foreign ports, or tell of entire ships lost. And they are not all adults because of the number of families who went to sea. The dangers of going to sea were real. Those at home worried, those at sea tried to ignore the risks. And I have several pieces about some of the disasters. Some of them are very short, a couple paragraphs, and some are longer. Some have to do with memories of women who went to sea with, at least with their fathers, and some have to do with women who saved the day. The first one is about Zenas Beals Ellis, who lived on the Cape. And Zenas, Z-E-N-A-S. Because of the way the Z was written, he is found in several ways in censuses because the Z is misread. He's also known just as Beals Ellis. But in early September 1881, Captain Ellis left Wilmington for Haiti, and he planned to retire after that voyage. The cargo on the Walter E. Palmer was 130,846 feet of lumber. A few days out of port, the ship and crew encountered a gale that soon became a hurricane. A big sea capsized the vessel. The crew of 6 were all thrown into the water. They grabbed onto floating wreckage, and a lot of it was the lumber that they were carrying. But only one man was able to hold on through the storm, and for the 4 days it took for him to be found by another ship. It was not headed to the West Indies, so he stayed aboard that ship, which was a Spanish vessel, until it reached port in Falmouth, England. And that trip was the last trip, definitely, for Captain Ellis, but not in the way he had hoped. The bark Alcyon was built in the N.G. Hitchman shipyard at the foot of Middle Street in 1865, and it first sailed under a Captain James Partridge. The Alcyon sank in August 1871, 6 years later. It had left New York Harbor bound for Londonderry, Ireland. The captain, Elias Patterson, 35 years old, and all the crew were lost at sea. The crew had included Aurelius and Eugene Patterson, the brothers of the captain. So 3 brothers were lost at once. Eugene Patterson's wife was Ella Adelaide Berry Patterson, and their daughter Eugenie was born in November, several months after the bark sank. So she, of course, never knew her father. The bark Arcadia was built in 1858 for Captain Nahum Mossman Berry. And he's another one that sometimes goes by his middle name, sometimes goes by initials. Her first trading voyage was to be from New York to Cuba. His wife, Mary Ann Shute Berry was going to accompany him along with their 2 children, Amanda, 9, and William, a baby. The first mate was Thomas Shute, his brother-in-law, and Thomas's wife Nancy would also go along. The rest of the crew was signed on in New York. Now they had to have some others in the crew to get from here to New York, but they wouldn't be signed on even if they were local men until the voyage actually started. The voyage to Cuba went smoothly. Upon arrival, the crew quickly started discharging the cargo, and Captain Berry went ashore where he learned that yellow fever was epidemic ashore. Yellow fever could spread quickly and was often fatal. Not a good time to have one's family aboard. Captain Berry was the first to feel ill, but soon almost everyone on board was sick. Mrs. Berry, the 2 children, the second mate, the steward, and 1 member of the crew remained healthy. But in 5 days, everyone who had become sick had perished. Another Stockton vessel was in port, and her captain allowed his first mate to take command of the Arcadia so the vessel could be returned to New York. A new crew was signed on, and soon they sailed for the States. Unfortunately, only 5 hours out of port, the first person on board came down with yellow fever. Before the end of the day, the entire crew was ill. Mrs. Berry, the daughter of a captain herself, knew navigation. She turned the vessel back to Cuba, and with only 1 man to help her, sailed the Arcadia safely into port. 2 days later, the entire crew had died. The new captain survived, but it took many weeks for him to regain his strength and was well enough to hire a new crew, and they finally set sail. That time, they made it safely back to New York, and Mrs. Berry and the children returned home. She'd lost her husband, her brother, and her sister-in-law, as well as all the crew members she had known. This story is quoted directly from the journal of Ada Mae Staples Hopkins. She was the younger daughter of Captain Everett Staples, and it was reprinted a number of years ago in a Penobscot Marine Museum newsletter. She said, at the beginning of the Civil War, Captain Everett Staples left New York in the bark Alina, which was built in Searsport and named for his daughter, Alina Staples. The Alina was on her maiden voyage to Liverpool, England, where she was to load for South America. She arrived safely in Liverpool, was loaded, and set sail for South America. But only a few days out from the St. George Channel, she was captured by the Confederate cruiser Shenandoah. When the Alina was sighted, a blank cartridge was fired across the bow of the Alina, and in answer, the ensign was run to the peak, and the ship hauled to. The Alina was then boarded by Confederate officers who demanded a surrender. Captain Staples and the ship were stripped of all their valuables, and the crew were taken aboard the Shenandoah, where Captain Staples was forced to watch as the Alina, with all sails set and her flags flying, was scuttled and sank beneath the waves. Some years later, Captain Staples was partially reimbursed for his loss. There were a number of claims made by ships from all over the Union after the war was over. This is also a list that was in Penobscot Marine Museum newsletter, And it is only Penobscot Bay vessels that were captured by Confederate raiders. And it gives the name of the ship, the tons, where it was built, what Confederate ship captured it, the date it was captured, where it was captured, and what happened to it, whether it was sunk, burned, confiscated, retaken, bonded. 2 were actually bonded, and 1 was a ship of a captain from Stockton, Captain Lewis Partridge. And in his obituary, it states no one knew why he was bonded and given safe passage, a certificate of safe passage for the rest of the war. But I have an idea it was because he was a Mason and the captain of the other ship was a Mason, because they were known to treat the prisoners of the opposition more fairly and considerately if they were both Masons. So I have an idea that may be the reason, but no one afterwards knew for sure. Ada May, who had written that about the Alina, was Captain Staples' younger daughter. Alina was her half-sister. Captain Staples made a lot of confusion for people, as many did. His first wife was named Mary, and his second wife was named Mary. So sometimes the children are combined and sometimes they're separate, but Alina was the daughter of his first wife, Mary Hitchman Staples, and Ada May was the daughter of his second wife, Mary Staples.
Explains a lot, doesn't it?
They go to the family reunion. Find the wife.
No, but there were a lot of cousins who married around here. And she was born January 17th, 1860. So she wasn't very old when the Alina was sunk. And she was born aboard ship when it was sailing in the channel between Africa and Madagascar. She lived on her father's ship until she was 3 years old. And then she lived back in Stockton until she was 10. At that time, she went back to sea with her parents, and they sailed to England and Cuba. At 17, she went on another voyage that lasted for 2 years. Her last voyage started when she was 26 and included sailing around the world and lasted 1.5 years. During her years at sea, she rounded the Horn 7 times.
Wow.
And visited ports in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. She married Herbert Hopkins and was the mother-in-law of Louise Hopkins and grandmother of, some of us knew, Betty Jean Hopkins. So a number of these stories were written in a column in the Bangor Daily News back in the 30s and 40s, I think it was, by Henry Buxton, who had been in newspaper work in Philadelphia. And I don't know if he summered in Sandy Point or lived full time.
Well, he started by summering, and then as the years went on, he was writing more and more in the Daily News, so he stayed longer in the year. And I believe that what he did is he joined a number of these Sandy Point summer people in the 30s down in Winter Park, Florida.
Ah, yeah.
So, or I know that he wrote some articles from Winter Park, Florida. And
Yeah.
if you look at the Bangor Daily News dispatches and things of that nature.
And he wrote about the people he met up here. And sometimes the column would be a number of different people, and sometimes it would be just one person. He interviewed a number of the women who were still living, who had been wives of captains or grew up as the daughter of a captain, and sometimes both. And they were published in the paper, but also a book was put together of a lot of his columns called Down East, Assignment Down East.
Yes, exactly.
And that is not just about sea stories, it's about a little bit of everything. And he goes into a lot of these stories in more detail. The next one is about Fanny Pano Clifford. Fanny was the daughter of your favorite, Captain John Pano.
Okay.
As a child, she sailed with her father and visited most ports in Asia. She married Captain Fred Clifford. In the two histories of Stockton, she is given, and in at least Alice Ellis's, she's given as marrying Frank Clifford. However, the vital records say Fred Clifford, and the census records are always Fanny and Fred. He could have been called Frank at one time. So many of them did go by middle names or nicknames, but the official name of her husband was Fred. And he, when he stopped going to sea, had a store on the first floor of the Masonic building for a while. But she married a captain, as many daughters did. And in 1887, the voyage she went on with her husband took them to the Far East and lasted 3 years. Near the end of the voyage, they loaded sulfur in Japan and headed home. They not only sailed through a typhoon, but had to deal with gales, blizzards, seas that washed over the deck and froze in the rigging. So they must have gone the Cape Horn route to have all that weather. One member of the crew was washed overboard. The fumes from the sulfur made many in the crew sick. 20 of the 24 men aboard suffered frostbite. Captain Clifford suffered a nervous breakdown. Fanny took charge of the crew, delivered the captain's orders, and nursed the sick. And 183 days after leaving Japan, they arrived in New York. This story is one of the first that I heard about one of the women who took over the ship when something happened to her husband. But it was only recently that I came across a copy of the newspaper article that was written about her from the New York Herald on the 14th of May in 1872. And she was Abby Clifford. Her maiden name was Longfellow, and she was from Augusta. The ship they were on was the Abby Clifford, named for her, and her husband was Captain Edwin Clifford. I don't know if she was a captain's daughter or not, but she often accompanied her husband on the ship. She helped with doing the money log, I know. I don't know about the other log, but The money log has two distinct handwritings. And the last part of that log, it's all written in one handwriting, which was Abby's. This starts out, the latest heroine who has come before the public is Mrs. Clifford of Stockton, Maine, who has just brought to port the brig Abby Clifford after enduring the bad weather, health, and climate. The Abby Clifford is a brig owned by Clifford, Smith, and others that left Brazil on the 27th of March, bound for New York with a cargo of sugar. While in Brazil, the yellow fever was at its height, and the crew were all taken sick, and the steward, T.T. Fay of Stockton, Maine, died. The rest of the crew recovered, and after getting a clean bill of health, they started homeward bound. Before they had been many days at sea, the pestilence broke out again. And the first victim seized was a seaman of the name of Gustave Johnson, who eventually succumbed and was buried on the 1st of April. The captain, a native of Stockton, Maine, of the name of Clifford, was then taken sick and died on the 5th of April. On the 9th of the same month, the first officer, Alan Smith of Steep Falls, Maine, also fell a victim to the same disease. It was at this time that the energy of woman was brought to light. For Mrs. Clifford, who had also been confined to her bed by yellow fever, on the death of her husband, came out on deck and undertook to navigate the ship. Mrs. Clifford is a woman of small stature, dark hair, pleasing face lit up with a pair of sparkling eyes, radiant with intelligence and fire. When the time came that she was called upon to preserve the lives of those on board, she was found equal to the task and nobly did her duty. On the voyage home, Mrs. Clifford was assisted by Mr. Hitchcock of Stockton, the second mate, and I don't know which Hitchcock it was. An intelligent boy who quickly learned from her the rudiments of navigation, which he probably already knew, and proved of invaluable assistance during the voyage home. They crossed the line on the 6th of April and met with favorable weather up to Cape Hatteras, where they fell in with heavy weather. Here the seamanship of the second mate was brought into requisition, and encouraged by the presence of his late captain's wife, who was always on deck, they passed through the storm with only some trifling damages. The Abby Clifford arrived off Staten Island on Sunday evening and is still in quarantine owing to the yellow fever. As soon as the vessel comes up to the dock, Mrs. Clifford will return to her friends at Stockton, Maine, carrying with her the heartfelt gratitude of the seamen of the Abby Clifford who owe their lives to the energy and presence of mind of the lady. Now, because this was printed on Tuesday, on the 14th of May, they made it into New York on the 12th of May. So she had charge of the ship from the 5th of April until then. She actually received captain's pay for all the days that she was serving as captain, and the owners paid for her mourning clothes. And that is recorded at the end of that money lot. Some of the things that happened, it's hard to believe that the women and children went through as much as they did, and that they kept going back just as the men did. Some of the often captains who sail to Japan, China, or other Asian ports, besides Captain Everett Staples, Captain John Pano, and Captain Fred Clifford, are Captain Hezekiah Harriman, Captain Isaac B. Dickey, and Captain Samuel G. Staples. There are others as well. It's not always easy to tell which ones are deep water captains. The shipping news that appeared in a lot of the papers, locally in the Journal, but also in most of the ports around the country, will often list the names of ships that have come into port, left port, or are waiting for cargo with the captain's name, but they're apt to have just Captain Staples or Captain H. Harriman, and that's not enough for you to know exactly who was the captain, especially since the families tended to pass the ship on to other members of the family. And a lot of times, the family members had the same name. For some time, Searsport has had this book of Searsport Sea Captains. And I was looking through it once and saw my great-great-grandfather's name as a Searsport captain. And why is his name in there? Because he grew up on Cape Jellison. He lived almost his entire life on Cape Jellison. The only time he wasn't there that I know of was when he was an innkeeper in Passadumkeag. But this is where some of newspaper research comes in. The Republican Journal, on the 22nd of March, 1906, included a piece like they did up until they were closed from our files 100 years ago or whatever. And it lists the coasting licenses issued Port of Prospect, now Searsport, in 1832 and 1833. And one man is listed of Belfast, one of Boston, the rest are listed of Prospect. Two of them are Barrys, including my great-great-grandfather. And this is one of the reasons why they would go through customs, which varied at times from Castine, what is now Searsport, Belfast, and even at times we had a custom house here. And depending on whether it was before 1857 or after 1857, when we separated from Prospect, the men and the ships would be considered of Prospect when they were registered or licensed. So many who are in there that I saw, oh, that person didn't live in Searsport. It was a very honest mistake from articles like this. If someone did not know the family, did not know the names of the family, they would have to go by what they read in the paper. And it's also interesting, all of these were schooners, and they ranged from 20 tons to 123 tons. So a schooner that was 20 tons wouldn't be going very far, but 123 tons would be going a much greater distance. On another date, the journal included changes of masters of vessels at Searsport Custom House from 1859 to 1873. And I copied that entire list. And this is one of the places you see a ship being passed on to other members of the family, which is interesting. Finding captains in the Searsport book made me want to get a list of captains for Stockton. There are lists in both Faustina Hitchbun's history and in Alice Ellis's history, but most of the names on the list are taken from the first captain of a Stockton-built ship, and that was not always a Stockton man. So you couldn't be sure that was the case. And Eric Penna, who used to live here in Stockton and volunteered at the Penobscot Marine Museum, had us taken a list. And part of his list was from the 1880 U.S. Census, which unfortunately the census taker in Stockton listed every man who went to sea as a sailor. Whether they were a cabin boy, a sailor, a mate, or a captain, they're listed as sailor. If they've been listed someplace else as a captain, you have a pretty good idea they probably still were captain at that time, but you don't know. And Jane Mercier from Searsport had taken a list, but again, this list was mainly from what was in the two histories. And I'd already found that there were some that shouldn't be there. So I wanted to do what I could. I started with those 4 lists, the 2 from the histories, Eric's list and Jane's list. And I had over 300 names. Then I checked cemetery records, vital records, and census records. And before I was done eliminating duplicates, I still had over 350 names. But again, I couldn't be sure whether they were Stockton men or not. I looked at town maps that had the names of the residents on them. At an 1863 Civil War draft that was done here in Stockton. And a Masonic history of the Pownell Lodge that was done in the 1890s, and it would include a paragraph about Masonic brothers who had died, and if they were a captain, they almost always mentioned that. In fact, that's the only place I found that Benjamin Partridge was definitively a captain. So I used all of those things. Plus, I went through some of the family files upstairs and family genealogies. And if I came across something purely by accident, because I was looking in the town columns for my own family, I'd find things there. The town columns at one time were really helpful because we had North Stockton, Stockton, Prospect Ferry, Prospect, Sandy Point, all had their own columns. They weren't always in every week in the Journal, and they weren't always in all the time in the Bangor Daily News, but they were there, and that helped to pinpoint where certain families lived. The research is not complete and probably can't be complete because some names, A. Henderson is listed as a captain. No idea what the A stands for. And unless you are a member of that family and are familiar with the names of the men in the family, we're not going to be able to confirm it. But this is going to be upstairs. It starts with an introduction, and then the second part has alphabetical lists of names. A's are not very big. For most, the front of the page is men that I have confirmed that they either grew up in town, they lived in town during adulthood, or both. And on the back are the names of men I have not been able to determine yet, or sometimes there is something after their name, confirmed, or that the name, like Mossman Berry, is actually Nahum Mossman Berry, so it's not two different names, or that they lived in another town. They were a Prospect resident. They were a resident of Surrey in one case I found, a Belfast resident. The H's and the S's have 2 pages because the confirmed names go onto the back page. Then everyone who is listed as a confirmed page has a page with some of the information that I've found on them. Sometimes it's just a small article from a newspaper because that's where I was able to confirm they were a captain. Sometimes it has names of ships that they commanded, and sometimes it says they were a deep water captain. There's no way I've been able to get all that information for all 236 names. But as much information as I've been able to get is here. That's all of them.
Excellent work.
And then some copies of newspaper articles about different captains. Some information that I've put together. These papers are going in here. And the Masonic paragraphs about different captains. So there is a lot that's in here, and it's gotten to be pretty big. I started out with a smaller notebook. But anyone who knows these families or who's interested in doing some research on these families is welcome to either let us know the information. Yes, you can confirm this man. No, he was not living here. Or give us the information that you've found, and it will be added to it, because the more we know about these men, the better. There have been problems. At one time, there were 6 Rufus Harrimans alive as adults. Yeah. 4 of them I have been able to separate out, not only that they were captains, but made sure they were the same man because of information in vital records, because of information on gravestones, because of census records. And usually I was looking at the children, not the wives, because the wives often changed. So that becomes a problem. Those multiple names were a lot of fun, and almost every family you find that. Sons would name one of their sons for their father. They'd name one of their sons for themselves. They'd name some of their sons for their brothers. So you'd have all of these in the same generation with the same name, sometimes as close as 2 months apart. So, and then those men who used their middle names or initials. And a lot of times that was to help distinguish them from someone else who used the same name. Until the 1850 census, only the head of household was named in the census. Sometimes there was a column number of people involved in navigation of the oceans. But you can't be sure that was a captain, and you can't be sure it was the head of household. If it says 3 people in the household, one might be a captain, you might have mates who were doing navigation. It could be a son, it could be a son-in-law.
Could be a brother.
Could
Families
be a
live together.
brother, yeah. So you don't know. In 1850, everyone in the household was named and occupations started to be given. Except in that 1880 census for Stockton. Other towns, they did differentiate, but not in Stockton. In 1890, we have no census. There was a fire where the census was being maintained. It was not destroyed in the fire, but the water damage ended up with it rotting and mildewing, and almost the entire census was destroyed after that. The part that remains is the veterans schedule for states starting with K and after. So Maine's veterans schedule did survive. So that's 30 years from 1870 to 1900 where we can't use the census for occupations. Before 1857, we were still part of Prospect. So just because they're listed as Prospect doesn't mean they live in what is now Prospect. They could be living some years, Swanville even, parts of Swanville. They could be what's now part of Searsport. They could be living here in Stockton. And this is where some of the maps come into play. And captains who stopped going to sea before 1850, you might not find information. Some probate records, some deed records could be helpful, but I haven't done any of that kind of research unless it was my own family. So anyone who wants to delve into this further would be wonderful. Now, of the families I mentioned at the beginning, I have the names here. There are 20 Staples names on the list, on their paper. 19 Harrimans who were captains, 13 Barrys, 14 Frenches, 12 Hitchmans, 12 Griffins, 11 Cliffords, and 11 Partridges. And there could be more in the unconfirmed names. And I know there are more for some of them, but they didn't live in Stockton. That's a lot of captains we had here.
Yeah, our house is supposed to be built by random.
Yes.
Or Rendell, whatever,
Yeah.
however
Yeah.
you pronounce
Yeah.
it. I think it had 2 L in, yeah.
Whichever of the 20 spellings.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that one I've only seen 3 or 4 spellings, but Lamphor I've seen more than 20 spellings for.
Yeah,
Yes,
excellent, really.
and most of these families, a lot of them have very few people who still live in town. There are some families, the Staples, the Harrimans, are still here. We do have a few Barrys, not by name, but by descendancy. And we don't have Hitchmans here.
You still have Shoots. It's
We
another
still
George
have Shoots, yeah.
We do have a couple of Harrimans, a lot of Harriman descendants without the last name Harriman.
Yeah.
That's true for all families.
Yeah.
As we're going there, and speaking of that, here comes Melissa Harriman, rooted behind us, and
Yeah.
yeah, right there, she's walking the dog right there, so there she is.
Yes, Ralph.
Of course, you mentioned someone, Pano or Pano.
Pano.
Okay, it reminded me that I've never looked to see what her connection was, but I have a Staples family, photo album with a picture of a Pano woman, or Pano.
Right,
There
I'll have to
was,
look it up now that
yeah.
it's a local family, I can maybe.
yes,
Yeah, see if she's connected with someone else in the.
I think she is.
Right,
So,
because Searsport has, I don't know if you have it in yours, but in Searsport, captains, you'll see a John Nelson panel,
Mhm.
as well as a Margie captain, so it could, maybe there's your connection.
And the original Pano here in town married a Catherine Lampfer. And at the end of Langworthy Lampfer's life, it was Catherine and her husband who provided a life deed, or were provided a life deed. They would take care of Langworthy Lampfer for the rest of his life. If they didn't, the land reverted to Langworthy. And because of that, we were able to prove that she was one of Langworthy's daughters who is not listed in the vital records. So,
Lanford, I just happened to being funny found an old ship's logbook, captain's logbook, Captain Lanford. I'm not sure what year it is. Someone made a scrapbook out of it to paste over every page.
oh
You
no.
know, clippings from the spiritualist newsletter, Banner of Light or something. So if someone knows how to get, I tried freezing it once decades ago, but I didn't want to steam it because I don't want to ruin the original. But anyway, Isaac Lanford, and the brig is master is a name I'm not familiar with. Looks like Carilda or Casilda. Anyway, if anyone knows.
Oh, was it the Briggs name that was?
Check it out,
Let me see if I can find that there.
And also on that same scrapbook, there's a 1891 Bangor Daily Clipper that mentions Captain Fred Clifford starting to renovate the house he just purchased in April of 1891.
Those newspaper town columns are wonderful. Isaac Lampfer, the captain who lived on Church Street,
Okay.
was a Lampfer, probably an illegitimate son. I'm trying to think of which Lampfer it was. He is listed in the vital records as the son of Mary Sweetser, Isaac Lampfer, being born. And in 55 Years at Sea, a book about Blanchard captains, I couldn't tell you who it is, but one of the women who married into the Blanchard family, it says she was the sister of Isaac Lampfer,
Okay.
and that would have to be a half-sister.
I'd love to see more of that. What's on now is Chip's logs.
Oh,
But
yeah.
if someone knows someone who could, I don't want to say try to steam the glue off on these other scrapbook pages.
Somebody at
but,
the museum could
Yeah.
probably help.
Yeah.
'Cause
It seems like you would
they
wanna
get to do
scan
stuff
it
like
just
that.
the way
Oh,
it
yeah,
is.
well,
And then you'd have a full copy of a scan of the
I
whole
know, but
thing
when I
without taking
scan,
it
we
apart.
just give you the stuff pasted on top
Yeah.
of the ship's
Yeah.
log.
Yeah, it may be too hard to
Yeah.
do.
And I guess there was a bunch of blank pages here too, so I guess the captain's log, that they had a form to fill out for each day, basically.
Yeah.
Wasn't-
Yeah, there is a
But-
way of doing that,
Yeah.
but I don't know if the museum can do
Yeah.
that for you without
You
sending it
just
to the
dropped the
store.
little one, right?
Because they've used
Between
that
Oh,
to
probably just-
read some of the scrolls that are rolled out
Yes.
on copper scrolls.
For that, they're using an MRI.
But
MRI or CT.
there are a number of different techniques they're using depending on what
Exactly.
material it's made out of. But all of these papers are going to be in there. The lists from the census, the lists from the draft of the Master Mariners and Mariners, all of those things are going to stay in there so that anyone who wants to check things out can. And you're welcome to come up and see these names or to look through the list. Yes, Mary Ann?
Yes, I have two questions. First of all, have you considered putting those online? And secondly, did you find anything out about Nealon?
Let's see. 3 Nealons are listed there, but I couldn't tell you without looking at the list. Plus, there is an E Nealon that is listed, and again, it's just by the initial. So, but there are some Nealons in there. It is not something that has been online. I started this during the pandemic, and I've finally gotten to this point. It definitely hasn't been put online.
Now that way, if, say, you keep it here and it's burned, the building burned.
Oh, yeah.
On
You
the
know,
website.
a
we have
storm
a
came or
website.
something, you would still be preserved.
Oh, yes, there's a lot of information that we have in different ways that would be nice to be online, but, we do not have a lot of people who are really competent in that way. And because the archives in Augusta have not been as available as they were, first the pandemic, and now they've been working at, I guess it's removing the asbestos from the building.
I think they're just now moving back.
Yes, they
I
are.
think they're just, right now I got a notice that they were moving back into their quarters.
Yeah, they have the machines and the willingness to help people do a lot of scanning, and anything that you do scan there, you agree to have it put on the Digital Maine website, which is the digital public library for the entire country, but our main section. But again, that hasn't been available for a number of years now, so. But you are welcome to come up and check out any of this, and there are refreshments that are available, and
Why did
in.
you look at me when you said that?
I wasn't looking at you specifically, I was looking at the whole audience. And in about 20 minutes, we'll start our business meeting.
Thank you very much.
Well,
Good job.
That was fabulous, especially your description of the beginning of the
Yes,
license
they
of
can
the master mariners, that, so much.
I have more.